When we look at a carbon, it's important to be able to describe how many other carbons are attached to it. This is methane. And if we look at the methane carbon, there are no other carbons attached to it. This is kind of the odd one out. Thankfully, it's rare because we're reliant on carbon-carbon bonds and that creating a network of carbons for life to exist. So I'm personally very, very grateful for carbon-carbon bonds. Here is a different sort of carbon. It's called a primary carbon. And primary carbons have one other carbon attached to it. This is a secondary carbon. Secondary carbons have two other carbons attached to it. Next, we have a tertiary carbon. And tertiary carbons have three other carbons attached to it. Maybe you're spotting a trend here. Okay, finally, we have a quaternary carbon. And as I think you guessed, quaternary carbons have four other carbons attached to them. Let's have a look at some more complex examples. This molecule is called manzamine A. And let's look at a specific carbon. What about this one? Well, this carbon has four other carbons attached to it. We haven't drawn the letter C, but as the lines zig and zag at each point, we know there is another carbon. So this carbon has four other carbons attached, so it's a quaternary carbon. Next, let's look at this carbon. Okay, we've got an oxygen attached, but we're not so worried about that. We're looking for carbons. There are three other carbons attached to this carbon, so it's a tertiary carbon. Moving on, here's a different sort of carbon. There are two hydrogens attached to this carbon. They're not drawn, but we presume you know they're there. But we're not going to worry about hydrogens. We're focused on carbons. How many carbons? We have two carbons, so this is a secondary carbon. And lastly, this carbon also has two other carbons attached. Now we'll look at Taxol. Within this molecule, you can see here we have a primary carbon. It has three hydrogens. They're not drawn, but we're not worried about them. It does have one other carbon attached to it, hence primary carbon. Next, if we look at this carbon, there are four other carbons attached to it. So it's a quaternary carbon. Next, if we look at this carbon, we have three other carbons attached. There is an oxygen, but we're not worried about it. Three carbons attached means we're dealing with a tertiary carbon. And lastly, if we look at this carbon, we can see there are two other carbons attached. So it's a secondary carbon. So we've seen the terms primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary referring to a carbon. Now this carbon has to be tetrahedral or sp3 hybridized if you like. There are, however, more specific cases where this terminology is used. Here you can see a formal 1+ charge on this carbon. It's called a carbocation. If we look at the carbon, there are no other carbons attached. It's a methyl carbocation, very similar in analogy to the methane we were looking at earlier. Here's a different sort of carbocation. It's called a primary carbocation. It has one carbon attached to it. This is a secondary carbocation. It has two carbons attached to it. And here we have a tertiary carbocation. This has three carbons attached to it. In addition to carbocations, we also use similar language when talking about alcohols. Here again is methanol. Like the methyl carbocation and the methane, it's the odd one out. it has no carbons attached. Here is a primary alcohol. It has one carbon attached to the carbon of the alcohol. Here is a secondary alcohol. The alcoholic carbon has two carbons attached to it. Lastly, here is a tertiary alcohol. The alcoholic carbon has three carbons attached to it. Carbon isn't the only atom we can use the terms primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary about. In specific cases, we can also look at nitrogen in a similar way. This is ammonia. Guess what? It has no carbons attached to it. So it's analogous to methanol, methyl carbocation, and methane that we've seen before. This is a primary amine. It has one carbon attached to the nitrogen this time, not carbon. This is a secondary amine. It has two carbons attached to the nitrogen. This is a tertiary amine. It has three carbons attached to the nitrogen. Lastly, this is a quaternary ammonium, not amine, ammonium. It has four carbons attached to the nitrogen. This terminology extends beyond amine and ammonium into amides. Here we have a primary amide. It has one carbon attached to the nitrogen. It happens to be the amidic carbon. This is a secondary amide. It has two carbons attached to the nitrogen. And finally, this is a tertiary amide. It has three carbons attached to the nitrogen.